The city of Chicago groaned under the weight of a bleak, gray afternoon, the kind that promised a cold, unforgiving rain. Skyscrapers clawed at the low-hanging clouds, their glass and steel facades weeping with condensation. On the street, a symphony of urban chaos played out, the blare of horns, the hiss of bus brakes, and the distant wail of a siren blended into a constant, stressful hum. Inside a gleaming, black Maybach S-Class, however, there was only silence. The world outside was a muted, frantic pantomime viewed through triple-paned glass. The climate control maintained a perfect 72 degrees, a stark, sterile bubble of tranquility amidst the city's frantic struggle. The air inside the car, thick with the scent of expensive leather and Julian's even more expensive cologne, was heavy with an impatient tension that seemed to press in from all sides. Julian Croft sat in the back, a statue carved from ambition and arrogance. At 48, he was the apex predator of the corporate legal world, known simply and fearfully as the Shark. His suit, a bespoke Tom Ford piece that cost more than the average car stuck in this traffic, was a dark gray armor, not a single crease or imperfection visible. His silver hair was cut with military precision, and his face was a mask of cold calculation, his eyes scanning financial reports on a tablet with an unnerving lack of emotion. He was a monument to success, a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a car and driver on call 24/7, and a reputation for dismantling opponents with surgical cruelty. But beneath the $10,000 suit and the unshakable confidence was a profound, echoing emptiness, a void carved out by a bitter divorce and the painful estrangement of his only son, a void he constantly tried to fill with control and dominance. The gridlock was unyielding. Every second lost was, in Julian's mind, a tactical disadvantage in the multi-billion-dollar merger negotiation he was already late for. His patience, a notoriously finite resource, evaporated. To hell with this, he snapped, his voice cutting through the silence like shattering glass. Use the bus lane. Now, the driver, a man paid handsomely to be invisible and obedient, hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. That briefest of pauses was enough to stoke Julian's fury. Did you hear me? Get in the damned bus lane. The heavy sedan lurched forward, illegally crossing the solid white line into the empty, tempting expanse of the dedicated lane. It was a fleeting moment of victory, quickly extinguished by the immediate, unmistakable flash of red and blue lights in the mirror. As Officer David Miller approached the Maybach, his posture was straight, his movements deliberate. He was not an imposing man, but he carried an aura of unshakable resolve. His uniform was modest, functional, yet worn with a dignity Julian's suit could never buy. His eyes, kind but etched with the weariness of someone who had seen too much, took in the opulent vehicle. Infuriated by the delay and the sheer audacity of being stopped, Julian stepped out of the car himself, a power move designed to intimidate. He flashed a business card from his elite law firm. "Officer," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I have a meeting that is vital to the economy of this city. I suggest you let us be on our way." Miller remained unfazed, his gaze calm as he began writing the ticket. The quiet scratching of pen on paper was an intolerable insult to Julian's authority. His arrogance boiled over. "You people are all the same," he scoffed. "You probably don't even know the law you're pretending to enforce. If you're already captivated by this story and want to see what happens next, take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more tales of transformation and redemption. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far our stories travel." Julian slid back into the Maybach, the heavy door thudding shut with a sound of finality, like a vault being sealed. The world outside vanished once more, but the insulated silence was no longer a comfort. It was a cage. He held the crisp, flimsy piece of paper, the traffic ticket, in his hand. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with a significance that defied its simple purpose. He stared at the handwritten details, Officer Miller's steady, legible script, stark contrast to the chaotic scrawl of his own signature on billion-dollar contracts. His driver, a man named Arthur who had worked for him for 6 years, remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward, radiating a quiet terror. For the first time, Julian realized he didn't even know if Arthur had a family. The man was just a function, an extension of the car. The thought was as chilling as the air-conditioned atmosphere. The journey to the merger negotiation continued in that suffocating quiet. Julian's mind, usually a fortress of legal strategy and ruthless calculation, was in turmoil. He couldn't shake the image of Officer Miller's face, calm, unyielding, and devoid of the fear or deference he commanded from everyone else in his life. The officer's voice echoed in his memory, reciting the municipal code with an easy, confident authority. Chicago Municipal Code 940080. The numbers branded themselves into his brain. He had been defeated not by a louder voice or a greater threat, but by simple, unshakable competence. He, Julian, the shark, Croft, had been stripped of his power by a truth he couldn't bully, a fact he couldn't sue into submission. The foundation of his identity had cracked. When the Maybach finally pulled up to the gleaming skyscraper that housed the opposing firm, Julian felt a wave of disorientation. The towering structure of glass and steel, usually a symbol of his domain, now seemed alien and imposing. The doorman in his crisp uniform greeted him with the usual, "Good afternoon, Mr. Croft," but the words sounded hollow, mocking. Julian felt as though everyone could see the ticket imprinted on his forehead, a mark of his sudden, shocking impotence. He walked through the marble lobby, his expensive leather shoes clicking with a false confidence he no longer possessed. He was an actor about to walk on stage, having forgotten all his lines, a king suddenly aware that he was wearing no clothes. He entered the 50th floor boardroom, a space designed for titans of industry, and took his seat. His team of junior lawyers and partners looked at him expectantly, ready for their leader to eviscerate the opposition. He spread his files on the polished mahogany table, the familiar ritual meant to center him. But as the meeting began, the numbers on the financial projections blurred, the complex legal arguments sounding like a foreign language. The faces of the opposing counsel across the table seemed to morph into Officer Miller's, their expressions calm, knowing, and quietly judgmental. The billion-dollar figures, the corporate posturing, the entire high-stakes performance felt absurdly trivial. His entire world had been reduced to the size of a traffic citation. The negotiation was a catastrophe. Where Julian was normally a whirlwind of sharp objections and incisive questions, he was now hesitant and distracted. He missed a crucial detail in a liability clause, an error his past self would have considered unforgivable. One of his own partners had to gently correct him, a moment of profound humiliation that was not lost on anyone in the room. He felt his carefully constructed persona crumbling under the weight of a single roadside encounter. He couldn't focus on the intricate dance of corporate warfare when his mind was trapped in the memory of being so thoroughly and quietly bested. The confidence he projected was a hollow shell, and the cracks were beginning to show for all to see. Unable to endure the charade any longer, Julian abruptly stood up mid-sentence, gathering his papers with a shaky hand. "We'll need to recess," he announced, his voice strained. "There are unresolved aspects we need to discuss internally." His team stared at him in stunned silence. The opposing side exchanged confused, slightly triumphant glances. Julian Croft never recessed. He never retreated. He walked out of the boardroom without another word, leaving a wake of bewilderment and concern. The invincible shark had just shown the room his blood in the water, a sign of weakness that could jeopardize the entire monumental deal. The power he had spent a lifetime accumulating felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That evening, his penthouse felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a glittering panorama of Chicago, a city he felt he had conquered. But tonight, the view offered no comfort, only a sense of profound isolation. The sprawling, minimalist space, decorated by an expensive designer in shades of gray and chrome, was devoid of warmth or personality. There were no photographs on the walls, no stacks of books on the coffee table, no sign that a human being actually lived there. It was a showroom for a life, not a life itself. He walked from room to room, the silence of the apartment amplifying the noise in his head. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 25, the amber liquid usually a source of quiet satisfaction. Tonight, it tasted like ash in his mouth. He stood before the vast window, looking down at the endless streams of headlights, a river of anonymous lives flowing through the city. He thought of Officer Miller, out there somewhere in that river, a man who went home to a life, not just an address. For Julian, this penthouse was his cage, gilded and luxurious, but a cage nonetheless. He had sought the pinnacle of success, only to find himself utterly alone at the top, with nothing but the cold reflection of a stranger staring back at him from the glass. The encounter had unlocked a floodgate of repressed memories, each one a testament to his emotional bankruptcy. He remembered a searing argument with his ex-wife, Catherine, just before she left him. "You're an empty suit, Julian," she had screamed, her voice raw with years of frustration. "You win every argument. You dismantle every feeling until there's nothing left. There's nothing inside you." At the time, he had dismissed it as bitter hysterics. Now, her words felt like a prophecy that had finally come true. He saw the truth in her accusation, a truth he had been running from for over a decade. He was a master of deconstruction, and he had successfully deconstructed his own soul. Then came the more painful memory, the one he kept buried deepest. His son, Daniel, as a 10-year-old boy, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. They were at a baseball game, a rare afternoon Julian had carved out of his schedule. Daniel had seen a player arguing with an umpire and asked, "Dad, is it okay to yell if you think you're right?" Julian, ever the litigator, had given a cynical, calculated response about leverage and perception. He hadn't answered the boy's simple question about right and wrong. He saw now the flicker of disappointment in his son's eyes, the first of 1,000 such moments that had eroded their bond until nothing remained but a strained, obligatory phone call on birthdays. He had spent his entire adult life equating strength with dominance and victory with worth. He had taught his son, through his actions, that kindness was a weakness and empathy a liability. The painful estrangement from Daniel wasn't a sudden event. It was the inevitable conclusion of a long, slow process of emotional neglect. He had provided for his son in every material way possible, giving him the best schools, the best clothes, the best of everything except the one thing he truly needed, a father. He had been a provider, a benefactor, but never truly a parent. The realization landed with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless with a grief he had refused to acknowledge for years. His current relationship with Daniel, now a 22-year-old college student, was a barren wasteland of polite, empty conversations. Julian would inquire about his studies, and Daniel would give one-word answers. Julian would offer financial support, and Daniel would accept it with a cool detachment that felt more like a business transaction than a familial connection. He remembered their last phone call just a week ago. He had boasted about a recent legal victory, a corporate takeover worth billions. Daniel had been silent for a long moment before saying, "That's great, Dad," with an utter lack of enthusiasm that had chilled Julian to the bone. He hadn't understood it then, but he did now. His victories meant nothing to his son. The next morning, his personal hell became a public spectacle. A colleague sent him a link with a single ominous message. "You need to see this." It was a video, shot on a cell phone from a bus window across the street. The quality was shaky, the audio muffled by traffic, but the image was damningly clear. Julian Croft, in his immaculate suit, condescendingly waving his business card at a stoic police officer. The video was titled, "Watch This Rich Jerk Try to Bully a Chicago Cop." He watched it 3 times, a cold dread creeping up his spine. It was a grotesque caricature of him, yet it was undeniably true. The arrogance, the entitlement, the sneer, it was all there. Within hours, the video exploded. It was shared on every social media platform, accumulating views at a dizzying rate. The comments section was a torrent of pure vitriol. He was branded Maybach Man, Buzz Lanebully, and a dozen other derisive nicknames. People dissected his posture, his suit, his cold expression, seeing him as the living embodiment of everything they despised about the wealthy and powerful. He scrolled through the comments, each one a tiny pinprick to his shattered ego. They didn't know him, but somehow They saw him more clearly than anyone had in years. They saw the hollow man he had become. The story was quickly picked up by local news outlets, then national ones. His face was plastered across television, screens, and news websites, always accompanied by the incriminating clip. The narrative was simple and irresistible, a story of unchecked arrogance meeting quiet integrity. He was the perfect villain for the social media age. His firm's public relations department went into a state of panic, their phones ringing off the hook with calls from journalists. His carefully managed reputation, built over 2 decades of ruthless efficiency, was being dismantled in a matter of hours by a 30-second video clip. He was no longer in control of his own story. To make matters infinitely worse, a local news station filed a public records request for Officer Miller's body cam footage. The Chicago Police Department, likely eager to showcase an officer behaving professionally under pressure, released it promptly. The high-definition video and crystal-clear audio were far more damning than the bystander's shaky recording. The world could now hear his exact words, dripping with scorn. "You people are all the same. You probably don't even know the law you're pretending to enforce." This was followed by Officer Miller's calm, devastatingly professional recitation of the statute. The contrast was brutal. Julian wasn't just arrogant. He was proven unequivocally wrong. The professional consequences were swift and severe. The CEO of the company they were attempting to merge with called the firm's senior partner directly. The conversation was brief. All negotiations were to be indefinitely postponed, pending a resolution to the public relations crisis Julian had created. The multi-billion-dollar deal, the crowning achievement of Julian's career, was now on the verge of collapse. The delicate architecture of the merger, which he had spent months building, was crumbling because of a moment of petty arrogance. The irony was as bitter as it was complete. He had sacrificed everything for his career, and now he had single-handedly destroyed it. The firm's board of directors convened an emergency meeting that afternoon. Julian walked into the familiar boardroom not as a conquering hero, but as a defendant awaiting sentencing. The partners, men and women he had mentored, bullied, and led for years, now looked at him with a cold, appraising distance. They saw him not as their brilliant leader, but as a liability, a toxic asset that needed to be managed or excised. The atmosphere was thick with betrayal and fear. His personal failure had become a corporate catastrophe, and they were all caught in the fallout. The shark was wounded, and the other sharks were beginning to circle. He was subjected to a brutal cross-examination by his own partners. They grilled him about his conduct, their questions laced with a barely concealed fury over the potential financial losses. They weren't concerned with his state of mind or the reasons for his behavior. They were concerned with damage control. The discussion quickly turned to mitigation strategies. They wanted him to issue a public apology, a carefully crafted statement written by a team of PR experts designed to placate the public and salvage the deal. They presented him with a draft, a hollow collection of corporate jargon expressing deep regret for any misunderstanding. It felt like another lie in a life built on them. That evening, his ex-wife Catherine called. He expected anger, a triumphant, "I told you so." Instead, her voice was filled with a profound, weary sadness. "I saw the video, Julian," she said softly. "Is that really who you are now? Is that what you've become?" The lack of accusation in her tone was more painful than any attack. It was a simple, heartbreaking question from someone who once knew the younger, more idealistic man he had been, long before the ambition had calcified his heart. He had no answer for her. The silence that stretched between them was a chasm of lost years and broken promises. He hung up the phone, the weight of her disappointment crushing him. His son, Daniel, did not call. That silence was the most damning indictment of all. Julian knew Daniel had seen the video. It was inescapable. He imagined his son watching it, not with anger, but with a quiet, familiar sense of resignation. This was the father he knew, the one who saw the world in terms of obstacles and inferiors. The lack of communication wasn't an oversight. It was a verdict. In his son's eyes, he was already judged and found wanting. The distance between them, which had once felt like a regrettable consequence of a busy life, now felt like a permanent, unbridgeable gulf he had dug himself. In another part of the city, Officer David Miller was ending his shift. The 18th District Precinct was a hive of controlled chaos, a constant churn of paperwork, ringing phones, and weary officers. The incident with the man in the Maybach was already a fading memory for him, just one of 100 small dramas that made up his day. It was noted in his report, filed away, and largely forgotten. He was more concerned with finishing his paperwork so he could get home to his family. He wasn't aware of the storm brewing online. He didn't have time for social media. His world was one of tangible duties and immediate responsibilities. He debriefed with his sergeant, running through the day's events: a shoplifting arrest, a domestic dispute, a fender bender, and a handful of traffic citations. He mentioned the stop on Michigan Avenue briefly. Some hotshot lawyer in a Maybach got pretty bent out of shape over a bus lane ticket, he said with a slight shake of his head. The sergeant grunted, barely looking up from his computer. To them, Julian Croft wasn't a symbol of anything. He was just another citizen who broke the law and didn't like being called on. It was a routine part of the job, a daily encounter with the friction between the law and human ego. Miller's commute home was on the L train, the elevated tracks rattling and swaying through the city's diverse neighborhoods. He stood in the crowded car, holding onto a pole, just another anonymous face in the sea of commuters. These were the people he had spoken of to Julian, the thousands who depended on public transit to get to their jobs, to school, to their lives. He looked out the window at the city lights beginning to twinkle against the twilight sky. He wasn't a man driven by a grand crusade, but by a simple, deeply held belief in order and fairness. His work wasn't about power. It was about service. He finally arrived at his modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. The moment he opened the door, the scent of garlic and roasting chicken filled the air. "Daddy's home," a small voice cried out. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, came sprinting down the short hallway and leaped into his arms. He lifted her effortlessly, her joyful hug melting away the stress and exhaustion of his long shift. This was his sanctuary, his purpose. The warmth and unconditional love that filled this small space were a form of wealth Julian Croft could never comprehend. It was a fortune built not on assets, but on connection. His wife, Sarah, greeted him with a kiss. She was a nurse, and her own eyes held a familiar weariness, but they lit up when she saw him. "Tough day?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded, setting Lily down. "The usual," he replied. "Had a run-in with a pretty arrogant guy in a fancy car. Made a big deal out of a ticket." Sarah just sighed. "There's a lot of that going around," she said, her voice laced with empathy. For the Millers, the incident was a minor annoyance, a brief glimpse into a world of entitlement so different from their own. They didn't dwell on it. They had a family dinner to share and a daughter's homework to check. Back in the corporate world, Julian sat before his firm's board. The par-drafted apology was placed in front of him. It was a masterpiece of non-admission, expressing regret for the perception of the event and pledging to learn from this experience. It was a document designed to make the problem go away, to smooth things over until the news cycle moved on. His partners urged him to sign it, to read it at a press conference they were already arranging. "It's the only way to save the deal, Julian," the senior partner insisted, his voice a low, urgent command. "Swallow your pride. Think of the firm." Julian stared at the words on the page. They were meaningless, a hollow echo of the man he was pretending to be. To read this statement would be the ultimate act of cowardice, a final surrender to the empty shell he had become. He thought of Officer Miller's quiet dignity. He thought of his son's disappointed silence. He thought of Catherine's sad, knowing voice. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the firm or the deal. He was thinking about the wreckage of his own integrity. A strange sense of calm settled over him. The decision was terrifyingly clear. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He pushed the paper back across the table. "I won't read it." The boardroom fell into a stunned, disbelieving silence. Julian Croft was defying them. He was choosing self-immolation over strategic retreat. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "This requires something more than a press release," he said, looking each of his partners in the eye. Without another word of explanation, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the ruins of his career and the astonished architects of his public persona. He was finally, truly on his own. He didn't go back to his penthouse. He didn't call his driver. He just walked. He walked 4 miles through the city streets, an anonymous man in an expensive suit, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and nascent resolve. He ended up in a dark, quiet neighborhood tavern, the kind of place he would never have entered before. The air smelled of stale beer and quiet desperation. He ordered a whiskey, neat, and sat in a corner booth, watching the muted news on the television above the bar. He was anonymous here, just another tired face seeking refuge from the world. And then his own face appeared on the screen. A news anchor was reporting on the Maybach man scandal, playing the body cam footage for the umpteenth time. A couple of men sitting at the bar grumbled. "Look at that rich jerk," one of them said, shaking his head. "Thinks he owns the world," the other one nodded. "Guys like that, they never learn." Julian listened, his stomach twisting into a knot. He was hearing his own epitaph spoken by strangers. He wasn't a shark. He was a jerk. He wasn't powerful. He was a bully. He saw himself through their eyes, and the shame was a physical, suffocating force. This was his rock bottom. He drained his glass, the cheap whiskey burning a path down his throat. It was in that moment, sitting in the darkness of a stranger's bar, that a sliver of clarity pierced through his despair. The board's apology was a lie. His entire life of calculated dominance was a lie. The only way forward, the only way to become a man his son might one day respect, was to do the one thing his pride and ego screamed against. He had to seek not absolution, but understanding. He had to face the man he had wronged and offer something real, something more than a statement drafted by lawyers. He left the bar, a new, terrifying purpose hardening his features. He pulled out his phone, his fingers tapping with a renewed sense of urgency. He didn't search for news about himself or the merger. He searched for the location of the Chicago Police Department's 18th District Station. He found the address. The path to redemption, he realized, wouldn't be found in a boardroom or a press conference. It would be found in a stark, functional police precinct where he would have to stand as a supplicant, not a titan. He hailed a taxi, the simple act of small but significant surrender of his usual insulated privilege. As the cab made its way through the city, he felt a fear more profound than any he had ever experienced in a courtroom. He was about to willingly strip himself of his last remaining defenses, his status, his wealth, and his arrogance. He was going to face Officer Miller not as the shark, but simply as Julian Croft, a broken man searching for a way to piece himself back together. The taxi pulled up across the street from the precinct, its brick facade illuminated by the cold, impersonal glow of streetlights. Julian paid the driver, got out, and stood for a long moment on the curb, facing his reckoning. Julian pushed open the heavy glass door of the 18th District Precinct and stepped inside. The transition was jarring. He left the quiet, cold night and entered a world of harsh fluorescent lighting and controlled chaos. The air smelled sharply of industrial strength cleaner, burnt coffee, and the faint underlying scent of human stress. Phones rang incessantly, their shrill tones punctuated by the crackle of police radios and the low murmur of conversations spoken in urgent, clipped cadences. It was a world entirely alien to his own, a universe away from the hushed, carpeted corridors of power where he reigned. For the first time in his adult life, he felt utterly and completely out of his element, a trespasser in a land with rules he did not understand. He approached the high front desk, behind which a uniformed sergeant with a tired, impassive face was fielding a phone call. Julian waited, feeling strangely small and exposed under the unforgiving lights. When the sergeant finally hung up and looked at him, his gaze was neutral, expectant. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone flat. Julian cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense environment. "I'm here to see Officer David Miller," he said, his own voice sounding foreign to him, stripped of its usual commanding timbre. "It's a personal matter." The sergeant eyed him with a flicker of suspicion, taking in his expensive, but now slightly disheveled clothes, before tapping at his keyboard with methodical slowness. The sergeant looked up from his screen. "Officer Miller's shift ends at 11. You can wait if you want." He gestured vaguely toward a row of molded plastic chairs bolted to the floor against one wall. Julian nodded, a quiet "thank you" escaping his lips. He walked over to the chairs and sat down, the hard plastic cold and uncomfortable beneath him. The act of waiting felt like a form of penance. His entire life was structured around efficiency, around bending time and people to his will. Now he was powerless, forced to submit to the rhythm of this place, his fate in the hands of a clock on the wall and the duty roster of a man he had insulted. The hours crawled by. Julian didn't look at his phone. He simply watched. He observed the relentless grinding machinery of civic life at its rawest edge. He saw two officers gently questioning an elderly woman who was lost and confused, their voices soft and patient. He saw a young, terrified mother reporting her teenage son missing, her sobs echoing in the sterile space. He watched as a group of rowdy young men were brought in, their bravado quickly evaporating into sullen silence. He witnessed a dozen miniature dramas of human frailty, desperation, and resilience. This was the world Officer Miller inhabited every day, a world of messy, complicated humanity that couldn't be organized into a legal brief. He began to understand that the law, for him, had always been an abstract weapon, a tool for dominance and acquisition. Here, in this precinct, the law was a messy, tangible thing. It was a shield for the vulnerable, a set of rules designed to impose a fragile order on a chaotic world. He saw officers display flashes of frustration, moments of weariness, but he also saw an underlying current of profound duty. They were the thin line between the city's orderly function and its potential for collapse. His own transgression, using a bus lane to save a few minutes, seemed so laughably petty, so profoundly disconnected from the real stakes these people dealt with every single shift. Finally, just after 11, a secure door buzzed open, and a stream of officers began to file out, their faces etched with the fatigue of a long shift. Julian scanned their faces, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he saw him. David Miller looked even more tired than he had on the street, his shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of his duty vest. He was laughing at a joke with a fellow officer, a moment of genuine, unguarded humanity. Then his eyes drifted toward the waiting area and fell upon Julian. The laughter died on his lips, and his expression instantly hardened into one of wary professional caution. The brief moment of camaraderie vanished, replaced by the guarded posture of a cop. Miller said something quietly to his colleague and then walked toward Julian, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, creating a zone of tactical distance between them. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice level and devoid of any discernible emotion. "What are you doing here?" The question hung in the air, heavy with suspicion. Julian could see the calculations happening behind Miller's eyes. Was this a threat? An attempt at bribery? A prelude to a lawsuit? He was being assessed not as a person, but as a potential problem that needed to be managed, and he knew he deserved nothing less. Julian stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his pockets. "I needed to speak with you, officer," he said, his voice raspy. In person, the precinct waiting area suddenly felt too public, too exposed. He felt the curious glances of the other officers and the desk sergeant. Miller seemed to feel it too. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the exit. "Let's go outside," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Julian followed him without a word, walking out of the precinct and into the cold, damp air of the parking lot. The parking lot was a bleak expanse of cracked asphalt, illuminated by the harsh orange glare of sodium vapor lamps. The sounds of the city were more distant here, muffled by the surrounding buildings. A few police cruisers sat parked in their designated spots, silent and imposing. The air was chilly, and Julian, who had left his overcoat in the taxi, felt the cold seep into his bones. Miller turned to face him, his arms crossed over his chest in a defensive posture. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and years of societal division. It was Julian who finally had to break it. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. "Officer Miller," he began, his voice cracking slightly on the name. "I came here to apologize." The words felt inadequate, flimsy things to repair the damage he had done. "What I said to you, the way I behaved, there's no excuse for it. It was arrogant, entitled, and profoundly disrespectful. I am truly and deeply sorry." He forced himself to hold Miller's gaze, to not look away. He needed the officer to see that this wasn't a performance or a legal strategy. It was a confession, offered from the depths of his own personal ruin. He continued, the words tumbling out in a raw, unpracticed flow. "For years, I've seen the world as a series of obstacles and objectives. People were either assets or opponents. When you pulled me over, I didn't see a man doing his duty, a man upholding a law that's there for a reason. I only saw an obstacle, an inconvenience in my way." He paused, swallowing hard against the lump forming in his throat. "It was only after, when I saw the video, when I heard myself, that I realized the kind of man I've become. And I was disgusted." His confession was laid bare in the cold night air. "You were right about the law. You were right about everything. But I was wrong about more than just a traffic statute. I was wrong about how to be a person. I was wrong about what it means to have strength." He finally looked down at his own hands, which were trembling slightly. "The truth is, I'm a lonely, empty man who has built a kingdom of wealth around a void. You, with your quiet integrity, held up a mirror to me, and I shattered." This was the most honest he had been with anyone, including himself, in decades. Miller listened to the entire confession without interruption. His arms remained crossed, but the rigid set of his jaw slowly began to soften. The suspicion in his eyes was gradually replaced by something else, something more complex, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a hint of empathy. He had expected a threat, a bribe, or a tirade. He had not expected this raw, painful display of self-awareness from the man in the $10,000 suit. He saw not the arrogant bully from the roadside, but a broken man shivering in the cold, stripped of all his defenses. After a long, heavy silence, Miller finally uncrossed his arms. He let out a slow breath, the vapor plumbing in the cold air. "I appreciate you coming down here to say that, Mr. Croft," he said, his voice much softer now. "It takes a lot to do that." He wasn't offering forgiveness, not yet. It was something more valuable, an acknowledgement of the effort, a recognition of the sincerity behind the words. He was meeting Julian's act of humility with an act of grace, creating a small, fragile bridge across the chasm that had separated them. Then Miller offered a piece of himself, a story to explain the principle Julian had so casually attacked. "You know, before I was a cop, I served 2 tours in the Army," he began, his gaze turning distant for a moment. "In a war zone, you learn that the rules, the protocols, they're not just suggestions. They're what keep you and your guys alive. You learn to trust the man next to you because he follows the same code. Integrity isn't some lofty ideal. It's a survival mechanism. It's the only thing you can truly count on when everything else is falling apart." He looked back at Julian, his eyes clear and direct. "When I came home, I promised my wife and my daughter 2 things. That I would always come back to them, and that I would always come back with my honor intact. This uniform, this badge, it's not about power. It's about that promise." He gestured back toward the precinct. "My honor is all I have. It's what I want my daughter to see in me." So when you challenged that, you weren't just challenging a cop writing a ticket. You were challenging the very foundation of my life. The exchange was complete. It was no longer about a traffic stop. It was about 2 men from 2 different worlds, finding a common ground of human decency. Miller extended his hand. "David," he said. Julian took it, his grip firm. "Julian," the handshake was a treaty, a pact of mutual respect that marked the beginning of Julian's long road back to himself. The following morning, Julian Croft walked into his law firm, but he was not the same man who had stormed out of it. The predatory swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, centered resolve. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now held a clarity that was unsettling to his partners. He called an emergency meeting of the board, and they gathered in the main conference room, expecting either a desperate plea to save his job or a declaration of war. He gave them neither. Standing before them, without notes or pretense, he announced his immediate resignation as the firm's lead litigator and managing partner. A collective gasp went through the room. The shark was willingly pulling his own teeth, an act so contrary to his nature that it left them utterly speechless. He didn't leave them floundering in confusion. He spoke with a calm authority they had never heard from him before. It was not the authority of dominance, but of purpose. "This firm is built on the principle of winning at all costs," he stated, his voice even. "For a long time, I championed that principle, but I have come to realize that some costs are too high. My actions have damaged our reputation, and for that, I am solely responsible. However, my departure is not just about damage control. It is about a fundamental change in my own mission." His partners stared at him, trying to reconcile this thoughtful, introspective man with the ruthless tyrant they had known for 2 decades. Julian then revealed the true scope of his transformation. "I am liquidating a significant portion of my assets, effective immediately," he announced. $50 million will be used to establish a new non-profit organization. He paused, letting the weight of the number settle in the silent room. "It will be called the Miller Foundation for Civic Integrity. Its purpose will be to fund community-based policing initiatives, to provide educational scholarships for the children of first responders, and to create programs that foster a stronger bond of trust and respect between citizens and those who serve them." The plan was audacious, concrete, and utterly unexpected. It was not an apology. It was an act of profound restitution. He had turned a moment of personal shame into a catalyst for positive, structural change. The foundation was his attempt to honor the quiet dignity of the man who had inadvertently saved him from himself. It was a testament to his newfound belief that true power was not in tearing things down, but in building them up. He looked at his stunned colleagues, once his rivals and subordinates, and saw them now simply as people. "I spent my life fighting for money and power," he concluded. "I intend to spend the rest of it fighting for something worthwhile." With that, he nodded, turned, and walked out of the firm he had built, leaving behind a legacy of fear to start building a legacy of hope. His next meeting was far more daunting than any corporate board. He met his son, Daniel, at a small, neutral coffee shop far from his usual upscale haunts. The initial moments were awkward, laden with years of unspoken resentment. Julian didn't try to fill the silence with excuses or justifications. He simply looked at his son, his eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. "Daniel," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I know I have failed you as a father in almost every way that matters. I was arrogant, absent, and I taught you that a man's worth is measured by his victories." He took a shaky breath. "I was wrong. I was a terrible role model, and for that, I am profoundly sorry." Daniel listened, his expression guarded, his arms crossed in a defensive posture reminiscent of Officer Miller's. He had heard his father's apologies before, quick, dismissive remarks meant to end an argument. But this was different. There was no agenda, no manipulation. It was a pure, unqualified admission of failure. Julian didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned it. "I don't expect you to forget the past," Julian continued, his voice low, "but I am trying to become a different man, a better one. And I hope that, someday, you'll give me a chance to show you that, for the first time in years." Daniel saw not the powerful lawyer, but just his father, vulnerable and asking for help. A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only reply, but it was enough. It was a beginning. 3 years later, the sun shone brightly on a newly dedicated park in a working-class neighborhood of Chicago. The air was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, upbeat music from a local band, and the sizzle of hot dogs on a grill. This was the grand opening of the Miller Park, the first major public project completed by the Miller Foundation for Civic Integrity. It was a vibrant oasis of green grass, new playground equipment, and community gardens in an area that had been neglected for decades. The atmosphere was one of pure, unadulterated joy, a celebration of community and renewal. Julian was in the center of it all, though he no longer sought the spotlight. He was dressed in a simple polo shirt and jeans, his face relaxed and tanned. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, greeting people by name, laughing with a group of children as he helped hand out balloons. The severe, calculated mask of the shark was gone, replaced by the open, engaging face of a man who had found his purpose. He was no longer a titan of industry observing the world from a glass tower. He was a part of the community, his hands dirty from helping plant the very trees that now offered shade to the families gathered here. Across the lawn, he saw a familiar face. Sergeant David Miller, now with a few more distinguished flecks of gray at his temples, was there with his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Lily, who was now a bright-eyed 10-year-old. The two men's eyes met, and they shared a smile of deep, abiding friendship. Miller walked over, and their handshake was warm and familiar. "You did a good thing here, Julian," David said, his voice filled with genuine admiration as he looked around at the thriving park. Julian placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "We did a good thing," he corrected gently. Their shared journey had transformed not only a man, but a whole neighborhood. The final, perfect image of the day was one of simple, profound connection. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, Julian knelt down beside Lily, who was struggling to get a brightly colored kite to catch the wind. With the patience of a man who finally understood the value of small moments, he showed her how to hold it, how to read the breeze, and when to let the string out. Together they ran, and the kite lifted, soaring high into the clear blue sky. Julian watched it climb, his face alight with a joy more pure and fulfilling than any billion-dollar merger he had ever closed. He had lost his empire, but had found his soul, learning that the greatest victories are not won in a courtroom, but in the quiet, humble service of a shared humanity. What do you think is the most valuable thing a person can have? Leave a little heart if you believe love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment love is priceless if you also believe in human kindness.